Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 25, Section 4, Imperialism in Latin America. And if you remember back a little ways, we talked a little bit about what imperialism is. This idea of building empires or a certain power being able to hold land over others. So, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the first imperialistic issues that the United States kind of had to deal with straight on, and that was the Spanish American War. And just so that we kind of let you know a little bit of the details here, Spain had still kept Cuba as a colony. And towards the end of the 1800s, in the 1890s, uh, the people of Cuba were ready for their independence. They had been ruled by a governor named Governor General Weyler. Weyler was very oppressive. Matter of fact, he actually had established concentration camps within Cuba to house those people who were basically being resistant towards Spanish rule. And there were those people who were calling for revolution. One was a man named Jose Marti. He was a member of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. He was also a poet and a journalist. And he had ties back to the United States, and we'll kind of mention a few of these ties here in just a minute. But as this Cuban Revolution began, the people of the United States really started to sympathize with the Cuban rebels because many of them kind of saw their struggle being very similar to that of our American Revolution. Okay, these rebels had some assistance. Remember, Marty was he was a journalist, and he had friends back in the United States who were also journalists. Probably the two most famous journalist of the day, William Randolph Hearst, who had the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, who owned the New York World. And also, when you think Pulitzer Prize, this is the guy that we're kind of talking about here, actually started printing stories within their American newspapers being very supportive of the Cuban Revolution. So stories in these American newspapers, they talked about the cruelty, the killings that were happening in Cuba, or the atrocities that were happening under Governor Weyler. And a lot of Americans were really becoming very sympathetic towards the Cubans, to the point where they were pressuring their politicians. And this is where President McKinley comes in. William McKinley was our president kind of in the late 1890s. And as a way to kind of appease the people who were asking for some kind of assistance on the side of the Cuban revolutionaries, he sent uh, probably the kind of the crown jewel of the American Navy at that time, a battleship known as the USS Maine, to Havana. And the whole idea was that it would be kind of a peace mission. The ship would go down there. It would help Americans who were living in Cuba. If they wanted to leave the nation, they would be there to assist. But for the most part, it was pretty much a goodwill mission. And initially, there wasn't really anything that happened. But on the night of February 15th, 1898, the battleship itself, the USS Maine, was sunk or actually blew up in the harbor of Havana. Now, there are a lot of conflicting reports about what really happened. It was originally printed in these newspapers that Spain had basically put a sunken mine and the ship had hit it, but the ship was anchored. And so, that kind of gets some people wondering what's going on. And there was basically an investigation where they went and they looked at, kind of the damage that was caused by this explosion. And a lot of it was inconclusive, but it didn't stop um, Americans asking for some type of retribution towards Cuba. Now, I do want to say, After years after this whole incident occurred, the U.S. Navy actually came out and determined that it was an accident. Back in the day, ships like the Maine were actually powered by coal, and they stored the coal in the hull of the ship, right next to what is known as the magazine. The magazine is where you actually store your weapons or the gunpowder. And what's interesting is it was believed that there was coal dust in the hole where the coal was stored, and that coal dust got hot and it combusted. And because you're right next to the magazine, you got a fire happening where your fuel source is. It probably doesn't come as a big surprise that you're asking for lots of trouble, and a huge explosion kind of came out of all of this. There were roughly 355 uh, crew members on the ship. Uh, when all the numbers were counted up, roughly 261 fatalities came out of this situation. And so it was at that time probably one of the biggest disasters that the U.S. Navy had ever had to deal with. As a matter of fact, it would be one of the bigger incidences of the Navy until we get up to the time of World War II, and we start talking about Pearl Harbor. We talk about the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. So Americans assumed that Spain was responsible for the sinking of the ship, and Congress, with a little prompting from our president, quickly declared war and sent troops to Cuba to fight. Spain did not send any additional forces to Cuba to kind of shore up their situation. And eventually, our U.S. Navy was able to attack the Caribbean fleet and destroy it. Not only that, but we had basically sent our Navy out into the Pacific, and the Spanish fleet that was in the Philippines was also eventually destroyed in one single morning. All in all, this war with Spain, the Spanish American War, only lasted 13 weeks, which is why it's kind of nicknamed the Splendid Little War, because it happened so quickly and it was over so fast. Anyway, the results of this war was that Spain was going to have to give up its rights to Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico. And the United States was going to pay $20 million to Spain for the Philippines. Cuba would not get its independence. Instead, it would become a protectorate of the United States, meaning that those revolutionaries who were demanding their independence, like the American patriots were back in 1776, they weren't going to get that. Okay, and there are a lot of questions about why, and there's probably issues with racism that kind of tie into all of this. But needless to say, the United States gained a lot of territory fighting this 13-week war. And that kind of leads us into this whole idea of kind of imperialism. Throughout the course of American history, there have been some different pivotal moments where policy kind of comes out favoring this idea of imperialism. And I want to talk about the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Quarterly, and this economic thing called dollar diplomacy. So anytime we talk about the Monroe Doctrine, this was a statement that was made by President James Monroe back in 1823. Monroe was what I would call one of the last of like the founding father presidents. And what he was doing was kind of asserting himself, basically issuing a warning to European powers to stop their attempts of making colonies in the Americas. That's not just in North America, but that's also in Latin America as well, because we would see this as kind of a hostile act. And the statement was originally made because of Russia. Russia was very eager to gain some territory in the northwestern part of the United States. So if you were talking about like what would be present-day Alaska, or moving into Canadian British Columbia and down into Washington and Oregon, we were fearful that they were going to try to, do something there. And by issuing this statement, we kind of made kind of our I guess, our feelings known. All right. Years later, when we get into the Theodore Roosevelt presidency, and this is going to be after the Spanish American War, he's going to issue what is known as the Roosevelt Quarterly, which is a little addition to this Monroe Doctrine. And this statement was made back in 1904, warning European powers not to intervene with the internal affairs of Latin American nations, while reserving that being our right, the right of the United States to kind of get involved. And this kind of opens the door for the United States to get involved in other people's business. 1904 is kind of an important year because that's going to be the year the United States starts getting involved in parts of what would eventually become the nation of Panama, with the hopes of building a canal. The idea of dollar diplomacy refers to the policy based on the exchange of money. In other words, the development of trade to develop better foreign relations. Okay, it sought to strengthen the power of a country or affect its purposes in foreign relations by the use of its financial resources. So, by 1912, under President Taft, the United States began using its money to enhance its power abroad, by contributing. So if we needed to improve our relations with a foreign country, we might offer financial aid. Okay. At different times, the United States created military governments in places like Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. And during the early 1900s, the economies of several of these nations in these areas almost collapsed. Matter of fact, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, all had constructed a blockade of the nation of Venezuela in 1902, force it to pay back its debts. And the United States obviously was not very happy about this. We saw that as kind of a threat, not only on countries like Venezuela, but a threat on the United States because these European powers were getting involved. So let's go back and talk about the Panama Canal. Originally, the canal was kind of planned, or at least talk of building a canal goes back to the year 1811. This is kind of at the time when we're kind of wrapping up the Napoleonic era. But a French company obtained the commission or the permission to build a canal. But the French obviously weren't able to finish this out for a couple of reasons. One, the technology wasn't quite there yet. They had to use a lot of manpower, and manpower in parts of the tropics is not always a good combination. Um, Many of the workers succumbed to yellow fever and things like malaria, which are all kind of brought on by mosquitoes. So, nevertheless, the French abandoned it, and it would be 1902, the United States Congress authorized the right to buy the French rights to build this canal. And when some political negotiations with Colombia, which, by the way, Colombia actually was a bigger nation, it actually included what is now present day Panama, kind of failed. The United States backed Panama, and what ends up happening is we have this little rebellion, and Panama kind of becomes a nation out of Colombia. And because we supported Panama, the people of Panama gave us the rights to about a 10-mile wide strip across the center of their country where this canal was going to be built. So, American President Theodore Roosevelt authorized the construction of the canal. Early construction, I mentioned before, we had problems with malaria and yellow fever. Thousands of men were killed. And so we bring in the U.S. military, primarily the Army, Corps of Engineers, and they declare war on mosquitoes. And they find ways to eradicate these mosquitoes, saving many of the workers, cleaning up some of these areas so that you don't have sitting water and such around. And eventually, work is going to continue. And it takes about 40,000 laborers, somewhere around 12 years, to dig and remove approximately 100 million cubic yards of rock from the canal. Matter of fact, if you ever look at pictures of the canal itself, the middle of the canal is actually a man-made lake. And it's basically one that was made by all these laborers. The canal itself was really kind of what I would say of the modern world, one of the seven wonders. So, moving to Mexico. The struggle for revolutionary reform in Mexico began around 1910 when dictator uh, Porfirio Diaz arrested a man named Francisco Madero, who was calling for revolution. Madero, at one point in time, is going to actually be elected the leader of the nation. Diaz is upset, kind of flees. Well, needless to say, Madero doesn't stay in power very long. He's actually assassinated. And what you're going to see is a series of different um, individuals who are basically calling for revolution within Mexico. So you have guys like Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, um, Pasco Orozco's. All these guys led forces against Diaz. These would have been men who probably would have supported Madero. The United States had issues with some of these guys, particularly with Pancho Villa. Villa had actually launched an attack into parts of New Mexico, and he attacked the city of Columbus, New Mexico. And what ends up happening is there were a number of Americans that are killed, and thus he becomes an enemy of the United States. And there is a desire there to bring him to justice. I will say this. Pancho Villa and Zapata, these guys were very elusive as far as not easily being captured. And hence, when the American military goes into parts of Mexico looking for these guys, it just is kind of I don't know if it's like a mockery of the United States, but it's almost like when the military was looking for Osama bin Laden. He was not an easy man to find. And there were a lot of people helping him not be easy to find. So, in number 14, U.S. the government feared that Madero was threatening American business interests, and they helped install a new president. In the end, Madero was assassinated, which we mentioned before. Rebels, again, overthrew the government. And over time, this guy that we see pictured here, Venustiano Carranza, he becomes your president. And it's when he becomes president, then we start seeing some stability, but he's going to rule as a dictator. Okay, he's got kind of an iron fist, and certainly this whole issue of corruption within the government of Mexico is not going to be something that is going to go away anytime soon. But anyway, he did oversee the writing of a constitution in 1917, and this constitution wasn't too bad. It removed the idea of the patronage system, which basically means that, if you kind of kiss up to somebody, that you are given certain privileges, like you get power or land or such. He's going to get rid of that. Okay, he's going to redistribute land to what we call communal holdings. So, in a way, this is supposed to look out for the poor, so that they have a greater opportunity of having the ability to acquire land. So a lot of the, haciendas and things like that are going to be kind of split up. It also guaranteed schooling for the poor. There was a social welfare program. It protected the rights of urban workers, and it also asserted national ownership of mineral rights and restricted the rights of foreign interests. So it wouldn't give like foreign powers like the United States, free, reign to do whatever they wanted within Mexico. The ownership of mineral rights, this basically meant that not just one person, but the entire nation would own the gold or silver, or even in more recent years, like petroleum rights. So, some problems faced by Mexico after 1870 and the 1917 Constitution. Some of the problems: you had some limited voting rights, you had wage decline, there was also revolution that damaged the economy. The reforms from the Constitution granted full male suffrage, so it didn't matter how wealthy you were. If you were a man, you had the right to vote. Women, not so much. There was land reform. There was also the protection of workers' rights. All right. Thank you very much.